Welcome back to Poor Richard's podcast. Today's guest was a lawyer, a revolutionary, a diplomat, the first vice president, and the second president of the United States, Mr. John Adams. John, where are you joining us from today?
From my home in Quincy, Massachusetts, though in my youth it was called Braintree. It's a quiet place now, much as it was when I was a boy. The house stands on the same land my family worked for generations. I suppose it's fitting that I end my days where I began them.
Let's go back there then. Tell me about that beginning, the Adams family in Braintree.
I was born on October 30th, 1735. My father was Deacon John Adams, a farmer and shoemaker, but more than that, a pillar of the local church. My mother, Susanna Boylston, came from a family of physicians, lively people, proud, quick-tempered. Between the two of them, I inherited a blend of piety and stubbornness. Life in Braintree was hard but honest. I learned to read from the Bible before I was 6. The fields were rocky and the winters severe, but the people were industrious. My father hoped I'd become a minister. That was the highest calling in Massachusetts then, but I wasn't born for the pulpit. I loved argument too much and obedience too little.
A familiar story among men of our generation. So when did the path turn from the church to the law?
I attended Harvard College at 16 in 1751. It was a different sort of education than what your Philadelphia schools offered, strict, theological, and heavy with Latin. I graduated in 1755, but even then I wasn't sure of my course. I taught school for a few years in Worcester to earn my keep and find direction. It was there that I began reading the law seriously. I remember one evening reading Cicero's orations by candlelight and thinking, "This is it. This is the language of liberty and reason." That settled it. I apprenticed under James Putnam, a capable lawyer, and in 1758 I was admitted to the bar. The practice was small at first, wills, debts, land disputes, but it grew steadily. Massachusetts was a litigious place even then.
I've often said that a man who studies law learns more about human nature than about statutes. Did you find that to be true?
Completely. The law shows a man's passions stripped of their ornaments. Greed, jealousy, fear of losing property, all laid bare. But it also reveals our desire for justice, our belief that right should prevail even when it's costly. Those contradictions fascinated me. In the 1760s, when Parliament began asserting new powers over the colonies, I saw those same human motives at work on a grander scale. It wasn't merely about taxes, it was about authority, pride, and who would decide what was lawful in a world an ocean apart.
Before we reach the revolution, let's talk about something gentler. You married Abigail Smith, one of the most respected women in our history. How did that come about?
Ah, Abigail. She was the daughter of Reverend William Smith of Weymouth. I first met her while visiting her cousin who happened to be engaged to one of my friends. I was blunt, impatient, and hardly the model of charm. She, on the other hand, possessed wit, intellect, and more patience than I deserved. We married in 1764, just as I began to find footing in my practice. She became my partner in every sense, not merely a wife, but an adviser. Her letters sustained me through war, politics, and distance. There were times, especially in Europe, when her judgment steadied mine more than the advice of any minister or envoy.
I can attest to that. Her letters are among the best of our era, clear, thoughtful, and warm. Few men have been so fortunate.
I never doubted it. If I accomplished anything worth remembering, it's in part because she held me to account. She reminded me that liberty without virtue is ruin.
You speak like a man who has already begun to see the weight of history. But before you were a statesman, you were a local lawyer. Tell me about those early Boston cases, the ones that set your name in the newspapers.
Ah, yes, the Stamp Act crisis was the spark. In 1765, Parliament required stamps on all legal documents, newspapers, and contracts. The outcry in Massachusetts was fierce. Mobs destroyed the stamp distributor's office, At the time, I wasn't a radical. I simply believed it unlawful to tax us without consent. I wrote a series of essays under the title A Dissertation on the Canon and Feudal Law, arguing that liberty and learning go hand in hand, and that ignorance is the tool of tyranny. It made some noise in Boston, though it wasn't my intention to become famous. But one event in particular changed my course, the Boston Massacre of 1770.
Yes, you defended the British soldiers, didn't you? That was a courageous choice for a man living among patriots.
It was, and I knew it. The night of March 5th, 1770, soldiers fired into a crowd on King Street, killing 5. The city was in an uproar. No lawyer would take their defense, fearing public wrath. I agreed to do it not because I sympathized with them, but because I believed every man deserves a fair trial. Without that, we'd already lost what we claimed to fight for. The trial was tense. Witnesses contradicted one another, the press inflamed passions, and mobs filled the streets. But in the end, 6 of the 8 soldiers were acquitted. 2 were convicted of manslaughter. It was the right verdict. I told the jury that facts are stubborn things. Those words have followed me ever since.
Indeed they have. That trial gave you credibility, not only as a lawyer, but as a man of conscience. Did you sense even then that the colonies were headed toward open conflict?
Yes, though few wanted to admit it. Each new act of Parliament, the Townshend Duties, the Tea Act, tightened the rope. Boston grew restless. Committees of correspondence formed. Merchants boycotted British goods, and pamphlets filled every coffee-house. I watched the movement grow, and I knew it could not end with petitions alone. By 1774, when the First Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia, I was chosen as a delegate. It was there that I first met you, Doctor, though I doubt you recall the modest Massachusetts lawyer sitting at the edge of the room, listening more than he spoke.
I remember the energy of those meetings well, and the arguments. You were never one to hold your tongue once you'd made up your mind.
True enough. I believed independence was inevitable, even before many others did. The question wasn't if, but when. The colonies were too diverse, too proud, and too distant to be governed by a parliament 3,000 miles away.
And so the lawyer became a revolutionary, but we'll come to that in time. For now, I think our listeners understand who John Adams was before the storm. A farmer's son turned scholar, a lawyer shaped by conscience, and a husband guided by a remarkable woman.
That's a fair summary, though I'd say I was also a man perpetually wrestling with my own temper.
You and I both. So you were bound for Philadelphia as a delegate from Massachusetts, the First Continental Congress. The colonies were still subjects of the Crown then, at least in name. Did you already sense that separation was unavoidable?
I did. Many of my colleagues spoke of reconciliation, but I saw too clearly the character of Parliament and the ministry. The British viewed us not as equals, but as dependents. Once a government believes it can tax and legislate for you without your consent, it will never stop until you have no rights left at all. When I arrived in Philadelphia in September of 1774, I found men of every disposition, cautious loyalists, bold radicals, and many in between. Virginia sent its finest, including George Washington and Patrick Henry. South Carolina had the Rutledges and Christopher Gadsden. I was younger than most, but I was not shy in debate. We argued for weeks over what authority we possessed and what course to take. I pressed for firmness, a united declaration of colonial rights, a boycott of British goods, and preparation for self-defense. My colleagues from the middle colonies counseled moderation. The result was the Declaration and Resolves, a compromise, but a step forward.
I remember the tension in those rooms. The air was thick with doubt, but also with conviction. You were among the first to say openly that the colonies must govern themselves.
Yes, though I was careful how I said it. The word independence was still dangerous. We spoke instead of rights, of representation, of natural law. But every man there knew where those words would lead.
You mentioned the Declaration and Resolves. Many today know little about that document. What exactly did it say, and why did it matter?
It was the first united statement of American rights. We declared that the colonists owed allegiance to the Crown, but not to Parliament, and that we were entitled to the same liberties as subjects in Britain: life, liberty, and property. It condemned taxation without representation, trial without jury, and the quartering of troops. We resolved to establish non-importation and non-exportation agreements, in plain terms, an economic boycott of British goods, until the coercive acts were repealed. It also called for the creation of committees to enforce those agreements. The language was respectful but firm. It didn't yet demand independence, but it made clear that obedience would depend on justice. In essence, it was our first collective warning: reform or face separation. When I returned home that winter, Massachusetts was already on the edge of war. The provincial Congress met in Concord, raising militias and stockpiling powder. General Gage in Boston called it sedition. By the spring of 1775, the first shots had been fired at Lexington and Concord. The Revolution had begun before any declaration could be written.
And soon after, you were sent again to Philadelphia, the Second Continental Congress. That was when the colonies became an army.
Indeed, I nominated George Washington to command that army. I'd watched him during the previous Congress, reserved, disciplined, and free of personal ambition. The choice was partly political as well. We needed unity, and a Virginian at the head of a New England army would bind the regions together. Congress was slow to act in those days. Many still hoped for reconciliation, but events moved faster than politics. Bunker Hill proved the colonists would fight. The burning of Falmouth proved the British would not restrain themselves. By 1776, even the cautious were ready to break.
Bunker Hill and the burning of Falmouth both seemed to harden the colony's resolve. Tell me about them. What exactly was Bunker Hill, and how did those events unfold?
Bunker Hill was one of the first great clashes of the war, though the name is somewhat misleading. The fighting took place mostly on Breed's Hill, just outside Boston, in June of 1775. After Lexington and Concord that April, the British Army under General Gage was bottled up in Boston, surrounded by thousands of colonial militia who had poured in from every direction. The Americans, short on powder and artillery, decided to fortify the high ground overlooking the city to threaten the British position. On the night of June 16th, they dug entrenchments on Breed's Hill, within cannon range of Boston Harbor. At dawn, the British awoke to see a redoubt that hadn't existed the day before. It was a direct challenge to their control of the city. General Howe led the assault. The British advanced up the slope 3 times under heavy fire. Twice they were driven back with terrible losses, more than 1,000 casualties in all. Only when the Americans' powder ran out did they withdraw in good order. The British took the ground, but it was a ruinous victory. When news of the battle reached Philadelphia, Congress was still debating whether the colonies should form a continental army. Bunker Hill settled it. It showed that untrained American farmers could stand toe-to-toe with British regulars. I remember saying then that the fight had made the stoutest hearts tremble, but also convinced the colonies that resistance was no longer mere protest. It was war. Then came the burning of Falmouth in October of that same year. A British fleet under Captain Henry Mowat bombarded the town. Today it is Portland, Maine, for refusing to submit. The attack destroyed nearly every building. No strategic reason, just retribution. That act shocked even the cautious men of Congress. It proved that the ministry meant to subdue us by terror, not by persuasion. After Falmouth, there could be no return to peace under the old terms. I think of those 2 events, Bunker Hill and Falmouth, as the hinge of the Revolution. One showed our courage, the other showed Britain's cruelty. It was then that I joined the committee to draft the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson, Sherman, Livingston, along with the 2 of us. Jefferson had the pen, I had the vote-getting.
I recall that well. He wrote and you argued.
That's a fair division of labor. Jefferson's draft was eloquent, though I suggested a few changes to strengthen its legal reasoning. We presented it to Congress in late June, debated every clause, and adopted it on July 4th. I thought then, and still think now, that it was the most important act ever performed by Congress. That night I wrote to Abigail that the day ought to be commemorated as the great anniversary festival. I predicted it would be celebrated with fireworks and parades for generations. She agreed, though she wished it might also be marked by reflection and gratitude to Providence. As usual, she was right.
You had the gift and the burden of seeing both the glory and the cost. But you weren't just a pen in Congress. You were sent abroad, were you not?
Yes. In 1777, Congress appointed me a commissioner to France to join you and Arthur Lee. The alliance was crucial. Without French support, our revolution might have failed. But diplomacy in Europe was no easy task. The French were willing to help, but they trusted neither our unity nor our endurance. When I arrived in Paris in 1778, I found that you had already charmed the court. You understood the French temperament better than I ever could. I admired your skill, though I confess I often found the pace of diplomacy intolerably slow.
You were never one for patience, John.
No, and that was my flaw as much as my virtue. I preferred straightforward negotiation. I found the salons, the courtesies, and the endless waiting insufferable. Still, we achieved the alliance in 1778, and it changed everything. French arms and ships turned the tide of war. I returned home briefly in 1779, helped draft the Massachusetts Constitution, the oldest written constitution still in effect, I might add, and was soon sent abroad again, this time to negotiate peace.
That was the mission that took you to the Netherlands, was it not?
Yes. Congress appointed me minister plenipotentiary to the Dutch Republic in 1780. It was one of the most difficult tasks of my life. The Dutch were cautious bankers. They would not commit to lending money to a nation that might not survive. I spent 2 years writing pamphlets, visiting merchants, and arguing in drawing rooms until finally, in 1782, they recognized American independence and granted a loan. That credit saved our finances.
And then came Paris again, the peace talks.
Yes, I joined you, Jay and Lawrence, to negotiate with the British. The French Foreign Minister Vergennes hoped to shape the treaty to France's advantage, but we Americans decided to negotiate directly with Britain, a controversial decision, but the right one. The result was the Treaty of Paris, signed in 1783. It recognized the independence of the United States and fixed our boundaries at the Mississippi. When the final document was signed, I felt less triumph than relief. The war had lasted 8 years. I'd left home for nearly half that time. My children had grown. My hair had grayed. I wanted only to return to Quincy and live in peace.
You've crossed the Atlantic more than once. What was that journey like in those days?
Long, uncomfortable, and perilous. My first voyage in 1778 lasted 6 weeks aboard the Boston, a small frigate battered by storms. The sea never rested. Men were constantly ill. At one point, we fought off a British privateer. The cold was relentless, the food barely edible, and privacy non-existent. Still, the voyage taught me patience. In that cramped cabin, I read, wrote letters, and thought about the meaning of the cause we served. When we finally saw the coast of France, it felt like sighting another world. I remember thinking, if liberty can survive such seas, perhaps it can survive anything.
Before we move on to that next struggle, the birth of the Republic, let's linger for a moment on your feelings at the war's end. You had seen both the Congress and the battlefield from afar. You'd crossed the ocean more than once, and you'd risked everything. What did you think of the new nation then?
I thought it a miracle. 13 jealous, quarrelsome colonies had stood against the greatest empire on earth and prevailed. But I also knew that independence was only the beginning. We had won liberty. Now we had to prove we deserved it. That, I told myself, would be the greater trial. Peace brought its own confusion. The Congress that had governed during the war dissolved into exhaustion. The Articles of Confederation had proven weak, too little authority, too much division. States quarreled over debts and borders. The treasury was empty, and public credit was nearly destroyed. I had scarcely returned from Europe before being sent back again. In 1785, I was appointed the first American minister to Great Britain. I took the post reluctantly. I'd hoped to stay home with Abigail and our children, but duty is a habit that's hard to break. My reception in London was civil but cold. When I was presented to King George III, I told him that I wished there might be a new friendship between Great Britain and the United States. He replied that he had always done what he could to prevent the war, and that he would be the last to break the new peace. We both knew it wasn't entirely true, but the courtesy mattered. Still, diplomacy there was a lonely business. British ministers avoided decisive talks. They were polite but dismissive. They expected our new union to fracture within a few years. Many thought the experiment would fail without a monarchy to hold it together. I confess there were times when I wondered the same. When I finally returned home in 1788, the Constitution had just been ratified. The government was to meet in New York. Washington was elected president by acclamation, and I, to my surprise and perhaps to my regret, was chosen vice president.
A difficult office, that one. No man ever seemed satisfied with it.
Nor was I. The vice presidency is the most insignificant office that ever the imagination of man contrived. It grants the appearance of dignity and the reality of idleness. The Constitution made the vice president the presiding officer of the Senate, but forbade him from speaking except to break a tie. I called it the most unimportant position that ever existed. Still, I did my best. I studied the Senate's rules, helped shape its procedures, and tried to keep debate civil. But I quickly learned that senators did not care for my lectures on decorum. They wanted politics, not philosophy.
And yet you remained loyal to Washington throughout his 2 terms.
I did. We were not intimate friends, but we shared respect. Washington valued my experience, and I valued his restraint. I supported most of his policies, though we differed in temperament. He possessed calm. I possessed candor. I envied his ability to appear untroubled. The great battles of those years were fought not with muskets, but with pamphlets and speeches, Hamilton on one side, Jefferson on the other. The cabinet was divided almost from its birth, Federalists favoring strong national authority, Republicans fearing it. I stood with Hamilton in principle, though I distrusted his ambition. Jefferson and Madison saw me as a monarchist. Hamilton saw me as a moderate. I often joked that I was attacked from both wings for standing in the middle.
You watched those quarrels grow into full parties, didn't you?
Yes, and it disheartened me. The unity we'd fought for during the Revolution was giving way to faction. Newspapers became instruments of war. Each side claimed to defend the people and accused the other of tyranny. I warned that parties would become our ruin, that they'd serve themselves instead of the nation. Few listened. By the time Washington announced he would not seek a 3rd term, the divide was complete. The election of 1796 was the first true contest between organized parties. I ran as the Federalist candidate, Jefferson as the Republican. The Federalists, led by Hamilton and myself, favored a strong national government, commercial growth, and firm ties with Britain. The Republicans, organized by Jefferson and Madison, championed agriculture, states' rights, and sympathy for France. Each side printed newspapers, organized committees, and rallied supporters, though we avoided the word party as if it were a disease. The campaign was bitter but informal. No speeches, no rallies by the candidates themselves. We relied on letters and newspapers to carry our arguments. When the votes were counted, I received 71 electoral votes, Jefferson 68. Thus, by the rules of the time, the 2 rivals became president and vice president. It was a flawed system, soon corrected by the 12th Amendment, but it showed how quickly faction had rooted itself in the Republic.
That must have tested your patience, sharing office with a rival so strong-minded.
It did. Jefferson and I had once been close friends, especially during our years in Europe, but philosophy divided us. He believed in the perfectibility of man and the wisdom of the common people. I believed in the weakness of man and the necessity of law. He admired the French Revolution. I feared it.
You mentioned the election of 1796 and how narrow the margin was. But tell me, how did the people themselves actually vote in those days? There were no ballots as we know them now, no nationwide campaigns. What did that process look like to the ordinary citizen?
It was far simpler and far less uniform than the elections you'd recognize today. There were no printed party tickets, no rallies, no speeches by the candidates themselves. In fact, I never campaigned at all. To do so would have been considered undignified. Most states didn't even allow the people to vote directly for a president. They voted for electors, and in many cases, even those electors were chosen by state legislatures, not by popular vote. Only a few states, like Pennsylvania and Maryland, allowed citizens to cast ballots for the electors themselves. The process varied wildly. Each state decided how to appoint its electors, some by district vote, others by the entire legislature. There was no single election day either. Voting stretched over several weeks in late 1796. So, in truth, the people voted indirectly and unevenly. The system favored the educated and the connected. Landowners, lawyers, merchants, women, and most working men could not vote at all. Yet, despite its limits, that election was the first true test of a peaceful transfer of power between rival political factions. It was clumsy, but it worked.
When you took office, you inherited Washington's cabinet. Describe it for us.
It was a capable but divided group. Timothy Pickering served as Secretary of State, Oliver Wolcott at Treasury, James McHenry at War, and Charles Lee as Attorney General. Most were strong Federalists, loyal to Hamilton more than to me. They were intelligent and industrious, but they took direction from outside the administration. Hamilton, though retired from Treasury, still pulled strings through them. I found it intolerable. A president cannot rule through another man's subordinates. Eventually, I dismissed Pickering and McHenry and appointed men of my own choosing. It cost me politically, but restored authority to the office. When I took office in March 1797, the country was prosperous but uneasy. Britain and France were at war again, and both powers interfered with our trade. The French Directory, angry at Jay's treaty with Britain, began seizing American ships. Diplomacy turned to insult, what became known as the XYZ affair.
Explain the XYZ affair in detail. It's remembered as a scandal, but few recall the substance.
After Jay's treaty with Britain, the French government viewed us as partial to their enemy. They began seizing American ships and refusing our ministers. I sent 3 envoys, Charles Pinckney, Elbridge Gerry, and John Marshall, to negotiate peace. When they arrived in Paris, they were met not by official diplomats, but by intermediaries who demanded bribes and loans before talks could begin. The envoys refused and reported the insult home. When I published their dispatches, substituting the letters X, Y, and Z for the names of the French agents, public outrage erupted. The slogan, "Millions for defense, but not 1 cent for tribute," swept the country. It united the people briefly and strengthened the Navy, yet it also inflamed passions that nearly led to war, a war I was determined to avoid.
You resisted that fever. Many expected you to declare war on France.
Yes, and I would have, had I believed it necessary. I built up the Navy, created the Marine Corps, and authorized privateers to protect commerce, but I sought peace all the same. I knew a full war would destroy our finances and risk the Union itself. In 1799, when France showed signs of reason, I sent a second mission. Many in my own party denounced me for it, Hamilton chief among them, but the envoys succeeded. The Convention of 1800 ended hostilities and preserved neutrality. History has since judged it wise, though at the time it cost me my presidency.
You mentioned creating the Marine Corps. Can you give some details on that?
Yes. In July of 1798, Congress established the United States Marine Corps as part of the naval expansion I urged. We needed disciplined troops for shipboard service and coastal defense. It was modeled after Britain's Royal Marines, but built on Republican principles, loyalty to the Constitution, not to a monarch. I signed the act without hesitation. The Navy and the Marines were essential to our survival. Within months, our ships were capturing French privateers in the quasi-war, proving that America could defend its commerce without succumbing to empire.
You mentioned the Navy and the Marine Corps taking action against French privateers. That conflict, the so-called quasi-war, deserves more explanation. What exactly was it, and how close did it come to becoming a full-scale war?
The Quasi-War was an undeclared naval conflict between the United States and France from 1798 to 1800. It began after the XYZ affair, when France refused to recognize our neutrality and seized hundreds of American merchant ships trading with Britain. Congress never declared war, but it authorized defensive measures. We commissioned new frigates, Constitution, Constellation, United States, and empowered our Navy to protect American commerce. The Marine Corps and privateers also joined the effort. Engagements occurred throughout the Caribbean. Our ships captured or drove off dozens of French vessels. It was America's first real test as a naval power, and we acquitted ourselves well. Still, the danger of escalation was constant. Hamilton and the High Federalists wanted a formal declaration, even a land army to march if needed. I resisted. My aim was to defend, not conquer. I feared that a declared war would draw Britain in and drag us into European alliances we could never escape. By 1800, reason prevailed. Napoleon had taken power in France and was willing to negotiate. I sent envoys once more, and they concluded the Convention of 1800, ending hostilities and annulling our old treaties with France. It restored peace without humiliation, a difficult thing in politics. Many in my own party never forgave me for choosing diplomacy over glory, but I've always believed that the greatest victory is avoiding a needless war.
That decision, to make peace rather than yield to pressure, was one of your finest moments. Yet it also divided the Federalists and opened the door to Jefferson's victory 2 years later. Did you expect to lose?
I suspected it. The Federalists were fractured, the Republicans united, and public opinion had turned. The Alien and Sedition Acts, passed by my own party, were used to silence critics. I signed them reluctantly, but I've since regretted it. They gave the appearance of tyranny and drove many decent men into opposition.
You've mentioned the Alien and Sedition Acts with some regret. Explain for the record what they were and why they caused such controversy.
They consisted of 4 laws passed in 1798 amid fear of French subversion and domestic unrest. The Alien Acts allowed the president to deport foreigners deemed dangerous and lengthened the period required for naturalization. The Sedition Act made it a crime to publish false or malicious statements against the government. Their purpose was security. Their effect was division. Federalist judges used the Sedition Act against Republican editors, turning it into a weapon against dissent. I signed the bills believing they would expire once the danger passed, which they did, but I underestimated how they would be perceived. They tarnished my administration and convinced many that we had betrayed the principles of free government. I never ordered a prosecution myself, but the damage was done. When the election of 1800 came, Jefferson and Burr tied in the electoral vote, throwing the decision to the House of Representatives. Hamilton maneuvered to secure Jefferson's victory, preferring him to Burr.
You mentioned that Jefferson and Burr tied in the electoral vote. But tell me, why were they the ones deadlocked when you were the sitting president and a candidate yourself? What made you run again in 1800? And what exactly happened in that election?
It's a fair question, and one that puzzled even those of us living through it. The system then was flawed. Each elector cast 2 votes for president. no distinction between president and vice president. The man with the most votes became president. The runner-up became vice president. In 1796, that system had already produced an awkward result: Jefferson as my vice president, despite being my rival. In 1800, the situation grew worse. The Federalists nominated me again, with Charles Cotesworth Pinckney of South Carolina as my running mate. The Republicans put forward Jefferson and Aaron Burr. I ran because I still believed the country needed stability, neutrality abroad, order at home. I knew my popularity had waned, but I felt duty-bound to stand for the principles of strong government and peace. My opponents accused me of monarchical ambition. I thought their attachment to France reckless. When the electors cast their votes, the Republican electors, meaning to choose Jefferson for president and Burr for vice president, all voted for both. That made them equal, each with 73 votes. The Federalists trailed behind. I finished third with 65. The tie threw the election into the House of Representatives, where each state had one vote. For weeks, the House was deadlocked. Some Federalists, out of spite toward Jefferson, considered supporting Burr, but Alexander Hamilton, though my political enemy, argued that Jefferson at least had principles, while Burr had none. His persuasion turned the balance. After 36 ballots, Jefferson was chosen president and Burr vice president. It was a bitter outcome for me personally, but an important test for the Republic. Power changed hands peacefully between rival parties, a thing almost unknown in the world at that time. I told Abigail that though I'd lost an election, the country had won an example. I bore the insult quietly. On March 4th, 1801, I left Washington before dawn, unwilling to attend the inauguration. It was a petty gesture, but I was weary.
You were leaving the city that would bear Washington's name, the same capital you had once helped envision. Did it feel like defeat or relief?
Both. I was disappointed, of course. No man enjoys seeing his work undone or his principles misrepresented. But I also felt immense relief. Public life had cost me health, fortune, and friendship. I returned to Quincy at 65 years old and found solace in my farm and my books. I believed then that history would forget me, that Washington would be adored, Jefferson admired, and Adams ignored. In truth, I was content with that, so long as the Republic endured.
It's a humbling admission, John, but your life was far from over then, wasn't it? You lived to see the next generation take its place.
Yes, longer than I ever expected. My greatest joy in those years was seeing my son, John Quincy, rise to prominence. He inherited the burden of public service and bore it with more grace than I ever did. But I am getting ahead of myself. The early republic tested all of us. We had built a government, survived division, and passed power peacefully. That last accomplishment alone justified every sacrifice. My return to Quincy in 1801 felt like closing a great circle. The world I left behind in Washington was loud with ambition. The one I came home to was silent but steady. I planted trees, repaired fences, and walked the same paths I had as a boy. After 40 years in public life, I finally had time to think. I spent those first months studying farming, philosophy, and religion, anything to quiet the mind. Abigail managed the household with her usual efficiency, and for the first time since our youth we could share breakfast without a messenger interrupting. The peace was strange at first, almost uncomfortable. I had lived too long in controversy to trust tranquility. Letters came daily from every quarter, politicians seeking comment, publishers wanting memoirs, foreign dignitaries offering respect. I answered few. I told them, "Let history make of me what it will." But I could not escape entirely. The affairs of government still reached my doorstep. Jefferson, now president, reversed many of my policies. He repealed the internal taxes, reduced the army, and let the Alien and Sedition Acts expire. My friends urged me to denounce him, but I refused. The people had spoken. That, I reminded them, was the essence of Republican government.
That's a rare grace. especially after such a bitter contest. But your silence didn't last forever. You and Jefferson found your way back into correspondence, didn't you?
We did, though not immediately. For 12 years we exchanged no word. Too much pride, too many old wounds. But in 1812, Dr. Benjamin Rush, bless his soul, persuaded us to reconcile. He said, "You and Jefferson are the North and South poles of the American Revolution. You must show that the Union still exists between them." I took his advice. I wrote Jefferson a short letter, light in tone, no politics. He answered in kind. That first exchange reopened a friendship that lasted 14 years. We wrote about everything: philosophy, religion, aging, our children, the state of the world. We seldom agreed, but we respected each other's reasoning. It was a conversation between two men who had seen the birth of a nation and were now watching it learn to walk.
Those letters are remarkable. They read like a dialogue between reason and imagination. Jefferson was always the dreamer, you, the realist.
That's true enough. I used to say he saw the world as it could be, while I saw it as it was. Yet we both wanted the same outcome, a people capable of governing themselves. The difference lay in how much faith we placed in human nature. He believed men would do right if given freedom. I believed they would do wrong unless kept to duty. Time, I think, has proven us both half right.
You lived to see enormous change, a new generation of leaders, the War of 1812, expansion westward. How did those later years strike you?
With mixed feelings. The Republic endured, and that gave me satisfaction. But the spirit of the Revolution, the sense of shared sacrifice, faded. I saw ambition where once there had been service. I told one visitor that I sometimes feared the American people loved wealth more than liberty. Still, there were bright moments. When my son, John Quincy Adams, became president in 1825, I felt a quiet pride I can hardly express. He had been a child during the Revolution, carrying messages between camps. Now he held the highest office in the land. It was a satisfaction deeper than any I had known in my own career.
You must have reflected then on the strange symmetry that you, the second president, lived to see your son become the sixth.
Indeed, Providence writes history in circles. I sometimes thought the Almighty allowed it to remind me that life is not measured by victory or defeat, but by continuity. Each generation inherits the task of preserving what the last built.
Tell me, John, after a lifetime in the service of liberty, how did you come to view it in your final years?
Liberty is never secure, Benjamin. It is not a gift that endures by neglect. It must be defended daily by reason, education, and virtue. I once said that our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. I meant that freedom depends on self-restraint. Without that, laws are paper and elections are noise. I grew more convinced as I aged that government is a moral enterprise, not merely a mechanical one. Republics fall not from invasion, but from decay within. If future generations remember us kindly, I hope it is for proving that free government is possible, though never easy.
You spoke earlier of religion. You were never one to trumpet doctrine, but faith clearly mattered to you. How did your beliefs evolve with age?
I was raised a Congregationalist, though I've always held to reason more than ritual. I believed, as you did, in providence, that divine order governs human events. In later years, I leaned toward Unitarian thought: one God, one law, one ultimate justice. I admired Christianity for its ethics, but I distrusted its dogma. Creeds divide, virtue unites. What I valued most was the idea that man is accountable to conscience, to community, and to the Creator who gave him both.
That sounds much like your public life, duty over display.
Duty has been the constant thread. I never sought fame, though I confess I wanted respect. I made mistakes, more than I care to count, but I never betrayed my principles knowingly. History may not love me, but I've lived honestly, and that is enough.
Tell me about Abigail. You've spoken of her often, But how were those final years together?
They were peaceful, though sorrow came as it must to all families. We lost friends, saw our grandchildren grow, and watched our health decline. Abigail's mind stayed sharp until near the end. She passed in 1818 after 54 years of marriage. I felt as though the world had tilted. She had been my equal in every sense, more sensible, more composed, and often wiser. Her absence left a silence no conversation could fill. After her death, I kept to my books and letters. Jefferson and I still corresponded. I read philosophy, history, even novels. The world moved faster each year, steamboats, canals, new states joining the Union. I marveled at it all and thanked heaven that the Republic endured.
And then came 1826, the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. Few men have lived to see their work so vividly commemorated.
Yes, I was 90 years old that summer, confined mostly to my bed. Towns across the nation planned celebrations. They sent me invitations, though I could not attend. I wrote short replies, expressing my gratitude. On the morning of July 4th, I awoke weak but lucid. I asked the hour, listened to the sounds outside, bells, distant cheers, and thought how far we had come. By afternoon my strength failed. My last words, they tell me, were, "Thomas Jefferson still survives." I did not know he had died earlier that same day, hundreds of miles away. Providence has a sense of symmetry that humbles the mind.
Two old friends, two founders, departing on the same day that marked their greatest work. There's poetry in that, even if you'd deny it.
Perhaps Providence allowed it, so that neither of us would have the last word.
If you could leave one message for those who inherit the Republic, what would it be?
That liberty is not the end of history. It is the beginning. Every generation must decide whether it will preserve or squander it. Study the past, discipline the mind, and remember that independence without virtue is only another form of bondage.
You've given them much to remember, John. From Braintree to Philadelphia, from the courts of Europe to the quiet hills of Quincy, your life traced the entire arc of the Revolution. Few men have served longer or more earnestly.
Then I can rest content. History may do as it pleases. I've done my part.
And done it well, my friend. And so ends our talk with John Adams, a farmer's son who became a lawyer who became a revolutionary, and a revolutionary who became a president. He never sought popularity, and he seldom found it, but few men ever served their country with greater honesty or endurance. From the courtroom in Boston to the Congress in Philadelphia, from the courts of Europe to the quiet fields of Quincy, Adams gave his mind, and much of his peace, to the experiment we call the United States. He was not made of silk or ceremony. He was granite, rough, unyielding, often weathered, but enduring long after storms had passed. He believed that liberty was not a birthright, but a discipline, something that must be earned, protected, and lived with humility. If the republic he helped build still stands, it is in no small measure because men like John Adams put principle above comfort and conscience above applause. This has been Poor Richard's Podcast. I'm Benjamin Franklin, reminding you, as my old friend might have said, that liberty is not kept by wishing for it, but by working for it.